Okay, welcome everyone to the Natural Resources and Environmental Sustainability Committee. We're going to try and move fairly quickly because we have a couple of presentations and not very long to get them in. And I know we have other commitments as well after. So do we have someone for the adoption of the agenda? So moved, Lynn, thank you. And with that, we're just going to jump right into our presentation. As I said, if around 20 minutes would be perfect, and then we'll jump right into questions, and we'll try to get to everyone's questions here because I know it is an important topic. So with that, the floor is yours.
Okay, I will introduce myself. My name is Qing, a hydrogeologist with the environment, water, and climate change for 9 years. Before I came PI, I studied and worked in Ontario in hydrogeology for 10 years. So today's topic is groundwater and surface water in PEI. We start from the basic groundwater flow, and water cycle. Then introduce groundwater, surface water interaction, seasonal variation, and analyze the long-term historical water resources using the surface water and groundwater monitoring data, and introduce how we evaluate environment impacted by groundwater extraction. Finally, we will present some results from climate change impact on the future water resources. So what is groundwater? Groundwater is water underground. They have two zones, unsaturated zone and saturated zone. Between them is groundwater table. So aquifers, we talk about aquifer is geological formation, transmitting and groundwater and store groundwater. More important here is transmitting. We know aquifers have confined and unconfined aquifer. In PI, we call the semi-unconfined aquifer. That means originally is unconfined aquifer, but locally could have confined aquifer because of impermeable clay and silicious stone. So all three types can be sustainable use groundwater supply. And typically in PI, our conductivity of the aquifer is decreased with depth, mainly by decreased fracturing of sandstone. Groundwater flow, always we know from high to low elevation. And finally discharge to the stream and sea. And because uniform hydrogeology in PI, we generally say boundary of the groundwater divide is same as similar to the surface water. And groundwater is from the precipitation and soak to the water table called discharge. And the groundwater flow is dominated by fracture in PI. We receive every year average about 1,100 millimeter per year precipitation. Then after on the ground, they're going to be separated. 440 go to evaporation and 220 runoff, or called overland flow, and 440 go to the recharge to turn to the groundwater. And finally, this groundwater slowly flow to the sea and ocean, and finally go evaporate, transplanted to the air, a complete cycle. So stream flow is important. We always measure the stream flow in PI and monitor that. How to measure the stream flow? Just quick summarize that. We always spot the measurement and stream flow speed, the volume and stream level, then create a rising curve. And we use the level logger to measure the stream level continuously, then using this rising curve, convert the stream level to stream flow. Because high permeability, hydroconductivity, we have very strong groundwater and surface water interaction. Groundwater flow can groundwater discharge, or called base flow, can 65% of average annual stream flow, and sometimes mostly is from base flow. And just point out that most of groundwater flow is occurred on the shallow part of aquifer. So recharge. We give you more detail. We know detail on the recharge. We know that 440 millimeter per year recharge coming. And then because we have so thick sandstone aquifer across the entire PI, so we have storage, large amount of water coming and storing large amount of water. So so if our groundwater extraction is below the recharge rate in annual basis, so our use water resources is sustainable. Currently, last 35 summer base flow, or about 20% of annual average flow maximum reduction by water extraction in any watershed in PI, much lower than recharge rate. And the below the slide is the table, so 5 gauge station long-term measure decades data. More important, we look at the yearly average stream flow, about roughly about 2,000 cubic meter per day per square kilometers, and base flow around 1,500 cubic meter per day per square meter, average 65 or 70% of the stream flow. And we use the base flow convert to the recharge rate. We can see the average for more than 440 millimeter per year. Then in central of the PI can above 500 millimeter per year. In western part, it can be lower than 400 millimeter per year. And last column show out is 35% of average base flow in August and September. This is the criteria we use the current policy to for maximum amount of reduction in stream flow. So we can see that the 200, 300 cubic meter per day per square meters, per square kilometers, this 35 summer base flow, only about 20% of base flow. That means roughly about 20% of the recharge. That means in the policy, we always not allow extraction in watershed basis above this 20% of recharge. So seasonal variation in water table, we know that after this season, water table and stream flow increasing because less evaporation and higher rainfall, higher precipitation. And after late spring, the groundwater table and stream flow decreasing. So groundwater table can fluctuate a couple meters to several meters in different places in average. And just point out here is the stream flow much higher, much sensitive than wells in terms of the groundwater fluctuation. For example, a few meters groundwater level decrease can cause small stream dry, but don't cause any problem for 30 meters domestic well. So we have several years headwater stream survey shown that in headwater stream naturally can dry up a few meters to more than 1 kilometer dry up in different places in PI, depending on topography. We see that this picture for a couple times, and we use only 1.5% recharge or 5 to 7% of the available water by the regulation. That means 35% of the summer base flow. But just imagine that every year we receive 45 centimeters of recharge. Then we extraction out less than 1 centimeter of water, and every year this amount 44 millimeter per year water and discharge to the sea and ocean. We can save this amount of water. So we always use well to assess groundwater. The well create a drawdown column because pumping in the well and outside the well then cause the water flow to the well. So majority groundwater into well is less than 60 meters depth, although many wells, high capacity well is much deeper than that. The shape and the size of the column of depression depend on the pumping rate and the characteristics of the aquifer. So because the groundwater is so stable and predictable source of the water, we can have the groundwater or usable wells everywhere in island. It's difficult than very different than other places in the world. We use high capacity well for high demand water demand user. So high capacity well we define as 345 cubic meter per day or 4 liters per second. We more depend on the actual usage of the well defined as high capacity well. Some well could have higher capacity, but then they use much lower rate, can consider as low capacity well. So high-capacity well, they designed no different from the domestic well, just bigger and deeper. You can show the table below at the bottom of the slide. We have 300 high-capacity wells, but above 20,000 domestic wells. We have to point out that municipality and agricultural industry have the highest high-capacity well numbers. The two industry account more than 60% of the high-capacity well. High-capacity well are an environmentally friendly and economically efficient way to use water resources. Give few examples here. High-capacity well have much lower impact on nearby stream flow than if you direct pumping water from stream. High-capacity well have lower environmental footprint and lower costs in construction and operation than low-capacity well with the pumps. A low number of high-capacity wells for central water supply is easier to protect from contamination than a large number of individual domestic wells. So further illustrate that groundwater extraction has much lower impact than surface water extraction. I use numerical model to simulate a difference assumption. In the Wilmot River, for example, have maximum 6 surface water permit above Environment Canada gauge station, but it can allow total 32 high-capacity wells in similar stream flow impact, or the impact by the well is much, much lower if same amount of water used. Similar in Dunk River, water was fully allocated by the existing 9 surface water irrigation permit and 1 groundwater extraction permit, but it can allow to have 75 high-capacity wells in similar stream flow impact, or the impact by the well much, much lower if same amount of water used. So we can do similar control of the stream flow or protection of stream flow, similar way to the surface water pumping station. Stream flow can be monitored and recovered by turning off wells similar to the manager of surface water pumping station. The below the chart show that, I don't go to detail too much on that, just show that when this is very highly unrealistic assumption, say huge amount of pumping in Wilmot River, then cause the stream flow reduction higher than our maintenance flow. Then we turn off the well in August, or then second scenario in September. Then stream flow will instantly and gradually recovered with times. So we have the groundwater quality monitor network across the entire island. More than 10 groundwater monitor wells and several hydrometric stations all have decades data. We use this data to analyze the long-term historical trend, how historical change on groundwater level and stream flow. We saw that the long-term trend of stream flow is flat or slightly uptrend with the seasonal variation in the last several decades from all the long-term monitor stream gauge station. And especially in the last decade, we have a slightly uptrend. And groundwater level history, similar in most of the stations, so uptrend, little uptrend, or we can call it flat. And similar last decades, we have uptrends in annual basis. Then we analyze the seasonal pattern. Although the annual trend is not much changed or need to be higher, but the seasonal trend is hugely changed. We can show the shift in the seasonal trend with the huge increased stream flow in January and February, and decreased after this period. In May and April, we have a highly reduced. Summer, we did see a little decrease or unchanged. But September always see increase. Groundwater similar, we can decrease in the winter to early spring, and decrease to late spring. And how we evaluate groundwater impact on environment, we have used various approaches. So we first talk about the impact on the neighbors' well, including domestic well or other high capacity, low capacity wells. And we use numerical approach or the pumping tester to analyze how groundwater impact. just give you an example here. See the figures. Here have have a full no in the figures upright. In full no capacity wells, we assume have very close to the domestic houses. So we assume these full domestic wells. Full no capacity well pumping 50 gallon imperial gallon per minute each for long time. See how much impact. In summer times, we can see the circle is the drawdown cone, and we can see about and 300 meters distance roughly reduced less than 1 meters groundwater level. So how we assess the stream flow impact by groundwater extraction? We use the water budget calculation. Luckily, in most watershed, our extraction rate much lower than stream flow, say a couple percent of the stream flow. And if the rate is go higher, say 10% or higher in some high demand area, we use the pumping test and analysis, and plus the stream flow monitoring. Lower right of the figure show when pumping test, then we can see stream flow reduction. And we also use numerical model to predict different scenario, predict different rate of pumping, different location of the well, see how impact on the stream flow. And we also always evaluate how groundwater extraction impact on saltwater intrusion. So basically, salt water and fresh water have one interface between them because salt water always heavier than fresh water. So fresh water table always higher than salt water. If we have high pumping rate on the fresh water beside the sea, then can cause the interface push in them. So we always assess that. And we usually use the chemical testing and numerical model pumping test, different approach, combine different approach to assess that. Just point out the many factors can affect the saltwater intrusion. One important here is well distance from the shore and well depth. And climate change have small impact on saltwater intrusion, but not much. Not impact not as high as the pumping by wells. So I have to point out that saltwater wells quite frequently used in PI that doesn't adversely impact on freshwater resources and doesn't cause saltwater intrusion in most cases. Then we present some results on how climate change impact on watershed scale. I did 3 numerical models in 3 watershed: Bear watershed, Bear River watershed, Mill River watershed, and Vermont River watershed. So 3 watersheds located in different places on PI and have different land use. I don't go to detail too much on that. Just go ahead and see that result. So climate change impact, and this precipitation temperature data is first from the original climate model. The original climate model is downscaled from the global model, global climate model. So currently, the original model they have about 10 kilometers grid daily temperature, daily precipitation data cover entire Canada, include PI. I download the data on the 3, just above the 3 watershed. And this is a figure show the example below the seasonal change on the Vermont River. And above the table show the different scenario climate precipitation on the 3 watershed, Bear River, Mill watershed, and Vermont River. We can see the precipitation in annual basis always nicely increased. But look at the figures below, and most of the precipitation increased is in winter times. So temperature, minimum temperature, similar to precipitation, we have a couple degrees increase in annual basis, but mostly increased is in winter period. Could have 7-8 or 7 to 10 degrees increase in different scenarios. Similar to that, maximum temperature mostly increase is in winter times. Few degrees increased in next. This is too fast probably. This is comparing the two scenarios from 2050 to the 1970s, so across 80 years period. So we use this climate data, put on a hydrological model, because we know the temperature change, precipitation change, but we don't know how much water change on ground and on the surface, because there could have many factors. We have to put on a hydrological model. They have many physical equations and many parameters we need. Run the model, see how much impact. First, most significant impact is reduce the snow pad on the ground in this 80 years period. In different scenarios, we can see roughly have more than 50% reduced on snow pad on ground. And the stream flow is changed similar to the historic data shown that increased stream flow in winter and spring and decreased late spring times, and didn't see much change in summer. So, and I didn't show under the result here, recharge also similar increased in winter and spring and decreased in late spring. And we just direct show the groundwater model result. Use the simulated recharge rate in 2050. Put in a groundwater model, see how groundwater level changes. This is a figure shown in the Bear River. We see a slightly increased groundwater level in annual basis. And we can see the P1, P3, P2, P3, that's three virtual observation points on a different location on the watershed to illustrate the seasonal change impacted by seasonal pattern impacted by climate change. We can see all 3 points all increased the groundwater level in winter and early spring and reduced in late spring, and didn't see much change in summer period. So we summarize that climate change impact on water resources. The numerical model predictions are consistent with the change of historic stream flow and groundwater level. In the last 40 years and next 40 years in PI, snowpack is reduced by half in most cases in 80 years period. Slight increase in long-term annual trends of stream flow and groundwater level. Stream flow has much stronger response than groundwater in stream variation. The earlier snow melt result in increase in stream flow in winter and subsequently decrease in spring. Groundwater level increase moderately in late fall to early spring and then decrease in late spring. In summer, water resources have only slightly decreased to unchanged. In summary, our presentation. The island has abundant groundwater to support social and economic needs, and high-capacity wells are an environmental friendly and economic efficient way to extract water from drinking water and all of industrial needs. We only use 1.5% of renewable groundwater resources, but there are high stream flow impact in some catchments due to intensive municipal and industrial usage. Potential well interference, stream flow change, and seawater intrusion are all components of an evaluation to approve a high-capacity well currently, and to approve low-capacity well after new water withdrawal regulations. Feed testing, desktop analysis, and numerical models are used to evaluate water extraction impact on the environment effectively to ensure that the local environmental impact are acceptable. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And ready for questions?
Yeah, I tried too much, probably a little bit rush.
No, that's
Thank
fine.
you. Yeah.
We appreciate it.
Yep.
First, Lynn?
And thank you for coming in today to present to us. This has been a really great presentation. I do have a couple of questions for you. We had a presentation a couple of weeks ago, as I'm sure you're aware, from another hydrogeologist, and one of the big takeaways was that calculating recharge is complicated. Do you agree with that? It's not as straightforward as saying we can be certain to get 440 millimeters per year of recharge. that there are a lot more factors at play.
Okay, I go ahead. So the most accuracy way to measure the recharge in large scale is measure the stream flow, then do space flow separation got in watershed basis, how much recharge you lay. So you can see the stream flow measurement in different watersheds have slightly different, but generally the variation in PR is much lower than other places in Canada or in the world. In other places, the recharge rate can vary 10 times. Here we have 10-20% different in different watersheds because uniform hydrogeology. And this is indirect way to measure the recharge is a confident way and accuracy way to do that. Some people use small scale to measure and direct how much recharge to measure how much water go to the soil. But then this is just small scale. So using that for watershed management is no problem at all. Although the year could have changed, but this data will analyze is long term, more than 30 years data.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. Something else that came up a lot in our last presentation, we were trying to get a sense of what is a safe amount of water that can be used before you start having environmental impacts. And an interesting reluctance we heard from the last presenter was to say what is safe. He was very plain in saying you cannot withdraw water without it having some impact. And what is an acceptable level of impact is really more of a political decision than it is a scientific decision, because you're going to have impact at any point. I'm just curious if you would agree with that statement.
I can take that. So I would agree that science tells you what the impact is. Science doesn't tell, and I agree with him that you can't withdraw water without having some impact. If you take water out of a well, it's intercepting water that would otherwise have made it to the stream, and that's basic physics, you can't get around it. So while the science can predict how much impact that will have on the stream flow, what it can't decide is whether or not we as people decide that it's acceptable or not. In other words, we have to make a compromise on what we want to do in terms of utilization of that water and what we want to leave for the protection of aquatic wildlife.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, that's how I'm understanding it now, too. And I'm hearing us say we're only using 1.5% of recharge or something to that effect, but we're not able to use 100% of recharge. We know that without it having a detrimental impact. Do you have a sense of what, I tried to ask this question last time as well and didn't get an answer, and I suspect you'll be reluctant to provide it also, but do you have a sense of what amount of recharge the province can actually withdraw without it having adverse impacts? But I suppose, again, the definition of adverse impacts is open to interpretation, but.
Right. I think I probably should let one of the hydrogeologists answer that one.
Yeah, if I could answer that. So there, one thing I'd like to just back up a little bit. It's absolutely true mathematically you can't withdraw water from one spot and not have an effect on the other. I think one of the key things we need to, and we're kind of centering in on this, is what's an acceptable impact versus no impact at all. It is worth pointing out, and actually Bruce can talk to this in more detail than I can, that we actually do have a yardstick we use now, and it's not based on the amount of recharge, it's actually based on the amount of, or the impact on stream flow. And so we've probably seen our policy document on groundwater and surface water extraction. So it actually does have a line in the sand at this point. The stuff Dr. Vanderhoovel's working on is to try to refine that, because that's based on sort of a statistical approach, which we think's reasonable, but it's not really tied to an actual biological effect. So that's one of the reasons for this additional study. From a groundwater point of view, simply if you're, and Chin sort of had this in his slide there, if you're pumping less than 100% of recharge, you're okay from a groundwater point of view. Groundwater is much more forgiving. We, for a policy, as long as I've been here, actually, I guess 30 some odd years, have not permitted more than 50% of recharge to be withdrawn. There's another key difference also. When you're looking at stream flow, you're looking at what's happening in a particular reach in a stream. When you're looking at groundwater, you're looking at the groundwater flow system as sort of a reservoir, if you will. So you're not as concerned about what's happening in this spot here versus what's happening 20 meters down the watershed, if you will. When you think of it, if you look immediately around a well, you're probably automatically exceeding 100% of recharge because you're counting on the water that's 20 feet or 100 feet or whatever away from the well. So it's a little different. But in terms of from a groundwater perspective, our policy of not allowing more than 50% of recharge to be extracted is extremely conservative to start with. I'm not sure if there's any other jurisdiction that's actually that stringent. You could go up to 100% or 99% and not have long-term effects. So when you hear of depletion of things like the Edwards Aquifer in the Midwest or whatever, you're looking at cases where they're exceeding recharge by a significant amount. We're way on the other side of that benchmark. So the term mining groundwater implies you're removing more than 100% of recharge.
Lynn?
Chair, and that makes perfect sense to me in the context of groundwater if we're looking at it in isolation. But as it pertains to all of the ecological impacts, that is different. We would agree on that.
Absolutely. Which is why we are no longer issuing permits based on percentage of recharge. It's impact on stream flow. And Bruce can describe it in more detail, but the current thinking is whether it's 30 or 35%, I can't remember, reduction of base flow during the critical months there. And perhaps Bruce would want to fill in a little more on that. But whether it's withdrawal from a surface water source or a groundwater source, we're using that same yardstick, and it's based on the impact on stream flow. So you're quite right. Groundwater is automatically taken care of because surface water is so much more sensitive. If we take care of surface water, we're automatically taking care of groundwater.
So if I could add to that, so in terms of the impact on the stream, we have an existing policy that we've had since 2010, and it's based upon science work done in the UK. And all that detail is contained in our policy and the supporting documents on the internet. What that, if you sort of dial it down to impact and the actual amount of water withdrawal impact, and how does that relate to aquatic life impact, that is by extension from experience in the UK. And it's because of that not being centered on Prince Edward Island that we have Dr. Van den Heuvel answering that particular subset of the bigger question about impact. He is, as he, if I recall, he alluded to it, if he didn't outright explain that that's what his current project is to answer the question of, is the, how much impact do you have from water withdrawal on PEI specifically? It doesn't matter whether it's surface water or groundwater, but in the site that he's examining, the new city's well field, that is a groundwater extraction. So what he is researching is, what does that site look like before the city established its well field, and what does that site look like after the city has established its well field? And then he will be utilizing that to give us general advice on extraction throughout Prince Edward Island. But as he, I'm sure is the first to mention, is that he's not going to be giving us that human question of how much is acceptable. What he's going to be giving us is that science question of, if you take this much, you have this, if you take this much water out of the stream, you have this much biological impact. And so that is a challenging piece of work to do. It's the kind of work that requires years, and hence why it's a 5-year project. And unfortunately, it looks like we're probably going to have to extend that project because due to circumstances beyond the city's control, the well field was late coming online, which affects the length of time in his study of before and post impact.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate the context there. I'm wondering if you can help me understand how maintenance flow levels are calculated currently. I have gone through this policy, but I'd be lying if I said I had it committed to memory, and I do not. I believe we are allowing a 70%, let's say a 30% reduction and maintaining 70% of stream flow levels, but I'm wondering if you could just speak to that a little bit for me.
Sure. So I think you're talking in the context of surface water permits. So in surface water permits, we issue permits on the amount of water that is in between the 70% flow duration and 70% of the median flow duration. So, and that's on a monthly basis. So for any given month, you look at the 50% flow duration and the 70% flow duration. We take 70% of that 50% flow duration, and then the difference between those two numbers is the available water. That tells us how many permits we can issue. So that's on the side of issuing the permit in the first place. Then secondly, during operations, when they're actually pumping from the stream, we have what's called in the vernacular is a hands-off flow. So that when the stream hits that flow level, that we generally stop pumping. So that hands-off flow criteria is 70% of the median monthly flow.
Lynn?
Sure. Thank you for that. Probably I'm going to have to reread that later to make sure I have a very clear understanding of it, but I appreciate the answer. I have heard from Dr. Vanden Heuvel when he was here that arguably we should be keeping 80% of stream flow, available flow, in calculating our maintenance levels. I'm just curious if you would agree with that.
So that observation by Dr. Vanden Heuvel comes from part of their work in the environmental flow needs study. And it's an examination of different models that are utilized in places, and an examination of some work that was done, if I recall, I think it was done in the United States. And they came up with deviations from natural flow. And under 10%, there was no expectation of impact. Under 20%, there was some impact. And under 30%, there was definite impact. Now that's in the context of where they were doing their work. So if I recall, that's where Dr. Vanden Heuvel gets that, at this time, interim recommendation of 20%. What he has been clear with us is that that doesn't mean that that's the case on PEI. And that's why he has to do the actual work on PEI to find out if those impact levels of 10, 20, and 30% and the expected impact that's in the literature from that, whether that translates to also be the case in Prince Edward Island.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. That's very helpful, actually. I'm wondering if you can give the committee a sense of what happens from a stream health perspective when we drop below the 70% maintenance level.
I'm more of a water person, but I'll try to answer your question. As I understand it, the expectation when you drop stream levels, the fish that would normally inhabit those areas may be forced to move. They may not be able to find an appropriate location. They may suffer also from heat stress, because as you drop water levels, temperatures may increase. And they are very likely to suffer from increased predation. They are likely to have, predators are likely to have easier access to them, both from outside the stream and within the stream itself. As it happens with trout, if you're a little trout, you fear the big trout as well.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate that. And that also assumes that they have the ability to move to another location too, which is not always the case.
And during the summertime and at low flow time frames, that is typically when fish don't move an awful lot.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. So do we issue water extraction permits when we are below that maintenance level?
Most of our permits are issued in the early part of the year, anywhere between January through June. so that criteria is nowheres on the horizon, mostly when those permits are issued.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with what happened in the Dunk River this summer, and we're trying to get a sense of how that permit was issued in the first place. Would that have been permitted through your department?
Yes. Another section of the department, other than the one that I look after, does surface water permits. And they would have permitted that early, well, more than one. There's if I recall the total number, I think it's like 9, on the Dunk River. And they would have all been permitted early in the year. They are permitted pretty much every year to the same people.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. So regardless of what the maintenance level is at, we would still generally permit these?
You'd be permitting them early in the year before you know what the future looks like.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. Isn't that a bit of a problem? If we are permitting it before we know what the future looks like, and then we're monitoring these, we see that there's a problem, but the permit's already in place? Is that how I'm understanding it?
The permits are already in place, and there's a piece on those permits that when we hit that hands-off flow, the pumping is supposed to stop.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. Can you help me understand why it didn't?
As I understand it, the producers in the Dunk River, not all of them, but some of them, made a request, and government decided to let them pump even though the flow was below that for a time frame.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. This is more of a comment. I know you have other people on your list, so I will put my name
And
back on the
I only have
bottom.
so much time.
I understand.
Yeah.
So I suppose my comment is we can know what the safe level, safe as we choose to define it, is for withdrawal, but if we're not going to stop when we actually exceed that, then it's a moot point anyway. So I think that's a huge concern for islanders, but I will let you move on to someone else, Chair.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. Excuse me. So during your presentation, did I hear that we're expecting more precipitation due to changing patterns through climate change?
Yes, generally, in different scenario, from global model to original model, most case is predict slightly increased precipitation and mostly increased in the spring and winter period, not much in summer times.
Steve?
Okay, the reason that puzzles me a little bit is because when I do a little Googling on climate change and precipitation patterns and PEI on the government's website, it says that we're expecting a reduction through the 2020s and perhaps a rebound by 2080 in the total amount of precipitation, down by 6% in the 2020s. So I was just wondering why there'd be a discrepancy between what government's saying is happening and what I guess government's saying is happening.
I did check a different global model and regional model. I don't know, you refer about most cases, they all say precipitation slightly increased. The most impact is temperature increased in winter times.
Steve?
Yes, and so I suppose that would give us more rain and less snow as we warm up a little bit. And as I understand it, a lot of our recharge comes from that melting snow as well, so that's going to directly affect our recharge rate as well. Excuse me. I have recently been speaking with someone who was telling me about the ability of our streams and rivers to flush out greenhouse gas emissions, carbon itself, through some complicated chemistry. When you change the temperatures and the organic matter levels in the streams, it takes away the ability of the water flow to flush that carbon out to the oceans where it gets sequestered down deep. And I was just wondering if you guys, being hydrogeologists, have had a look at that kind of thing. It seems like exactly what a hydrogeologist would be looking at.
I see Chin's looking at me, and actually that's the first thing I've heard of that, quite honestly. So it'd be interesting. I mean, it may or may not be significant. I really don't know. I'm curious about the mechanism, whether it's just stream flow and the amount of sediment load it's carrying, or what, because I could see that being a double-edged sword too as well. So, I mean, presumably we want to try to reduce sediment transport by stream flow. Anyway, it's not something I've come across.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. That's good.
Send us a copy of the article or whatever. That would be helpful.
Yeah, I believe there'll be an article published here fairly soon. So
You good?
yeah.
Rob?
Thanks very much for your presentation, Bruce and George. You're getting pretty familiar with these legislative committees. In your presentation, you mentioned a bit about municipalities, aquaculture, have the highest high-capacity wells on the island. And I believe I recall from past ones, about 360 high-capacity wells, about 30 that are agriculturally assigned to agriculture or whatever from the past, before the moratorium was put in place. Correct me if I'm a bit wrong on those numbers, but I think they're pretty close. Is there any science that sort of says that agricultural irrigation has a different impact on water tables than other high-capacity wells assigned to other professions or other industries?
No, we just, let me answer that. We just, same amount of water extraction from ground, the impact should be same, for different purpose. So, but agriculture area in certain watershed and have high density, say we are Mount River or Dunkirk River, we do the worst of the worst scenario model, and there's still many cases, and there's still acceptable impact. So no different in the proposal for different proposals. And from my sense is agricultural water irrigation probably can improve the water quality in terms of nitrate and pesticide, such as for directly the crop can better use this nitrate, so not discharge to the groundwater, and this is a more serious problem in PEI, nitrate or pesticide problem, can reduce that. And indirectly, if farmers can increase that, farmers always say increase 20 or so production after irrigation, now farmers have capacity to do some works benefit to environment, such in retire some land or increase buffer zone, such like that, increase water quality.
Rob? Oh, yeah, sure.
Just to help your memory piece, the high-capacity wells on PEI are on our website. The total number is 308, and agricultural irrigation is 36.
Good to correct that. Yes,
Rob?
we weren't far off. So I guess that's my very point, is that from a scientific perspective, we're really not having any difference between the amount of wells. There's a moratorium for agricultural irrigation. There's no moratorium for high-capacity wells for other industries, yet the science would say that there's no difference, and yet we're singling out one particular industry. I would argue that you're discriminating against a particular industry, an industry that produces food, versus maybe other usages for water that could be more industrial or things of that nature. Would there be, you'd mentioned the benefits of the whole issues of nitrates, less use, better fertilization of applications, better utilization of your fertilizer. From a pure water perspective, say, versus a municipality or an industry where water gets used and sent somewhere, versus agriculture where it's really put back on the ground and some percolation, I suppose, could occur. So would there be other benefits besides just fertilization issues and nitrate overload issues that would be from high-capacity irrigation in the agricultural industry? I mean, it doesn't sound like to me there would logically be any impacts, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mentioned before, could reduce nitrate contamination after agricultural irrigation.
So there's a benefit there.
Yeah.
Rob?
So the other side of this is that there was a moratorium put on in the 90s, I believe. Any sense? Maybe you might tell them what the date was again there. But was there any science utilized to put that moratorium on at that time?
I can perhaps speak to that. There was lots of science discussed at the time, but I think the very initial institution of the moratorium was there was an exponential increase in demands for high-capacity wells, and I think that caused people a little concern, not knowing where all this was going, and so they sort of hit the pause button. Unfortunately, they didn't figure out how to unpause it, perhaps. I'm not sure, but editorial comment. But that was essentially it. It was the rapid increase. We used to get 4 or 5 or maybe 10 applications for irrigation wells in the past, and that was actually a fairly new trend in itself. Going back to the mid-90s, there were very few before that. Then all of a sudden we had, instead of like 5 or 6 applications at our desk, we had 40. And so I think people got concerned at that point and wanted to step back and just see what the impacts are.
Rob?
So very basically, there was more of an unknown at the time that there, and there was a high interest at that particular time. As I recall, at that time there was impacts around agricultural production. Potato producers were having a struggle in trying to deal with the lack of moisture at certain times of the year. We sort of seen that same scenario happen this year. From what I would see, at least in my area, you've seen large amounts of water in the spring. You had rather wet land, and then all of a sudden the rain stopped for a period of time through July and August and came back again. What's your answer to, or what's your response to a farmer saying that, you know, my yields were down probably 25–30% this year. There's no science that says that I'm having a different impact than any other industry, and yet I'm having to deal with this reduction in production, which would have an impact on their profitability when there's no science involved. How do you respond to that, or what would you say to those farmers?
Well, I guess the moratorium wasn't put in place by me or any of these other gentlemen. So I think really it's a question for government as a whole, rather than, and we've gone through a number of different governments during that time frame. So I'm not trying to pin it on any particular group, but it's really much like, you know, Bruce talked before. We can look at impacts in terms of stream flows on fish and things like that. What we can tell you is if you do this, that's the result. And what Mike's trying to do is refine that a little bit when it comes to fish. That doesn't answer the question, you know, exactly what our policy is going to be in terms of how we use water, things like that. So it's really, our expertise would be, you know, if you drill a well and pump this much water, this is what's going to happen. Whether that's going to be acceptable or not is a broader societal question, I guess.
Rob?
So I'll just kind of wrap it up a bit here. But so government had the authority to, when it deals with extraction out of streams, you had the authority to, when levels got to a point, you had the authority to say no, but government made a decision differently on that. That's fine in this particular case. Would you not have the same ability to high-capacity wells to say if there was negative impacts to other items, things, people, whatever it might be, to say, you have to shut the well off, because I think, as the doctor had mentioned, that things will rebound back from a groundwater level over a period of time. That recharge will kind of get back to an even level. I'm assuming you have that authority now to do that, and can you explain that in a little more detail?
Yeah, well, actually, just stepping back and going back to the 90s or whatever. I mean, traditionally, and still in many places, groundwater and surface water are managed completely differently. And in the groundwater section, our philosophy was we didn't want to issue a permit for someone where they would then have to not be able to use it. It was a big investment. I mean, not that surface water irrigation isn't as well, but just in general, in terms of high-capacity wells and looking at the cost of the studies you need to do and all that sort of stuff. So we don't want to lead someone down the garden path. So that was kind of the philosophy for that. Now, it is true, and Qing actually showed a slide demonstrating this, that yes, you could shut off a groundwater well and reduce the impact on stream flow fairly quickly. It's a little more complicated with groundwater, though, because you might have all kinds of different wells in an area, domestic wells, high-capacity wells for irrigation, maybe high-capacity wells for some industrial thing. And so figure out which wells are doing what and all that. It's sort of below ground. If you've got a pump nozzle stuck in a stream, it's pretty easy to figure out what the impact is. It's not quite as easy for groundwater. But what you suggest is not undoable, but it's not the way things sort of evolved, I guess, would be the way I'd put it.
Well, I think ultimately for me, I believe it's just, we're really discriminating against one particular industry. You have the power and ability to influence the amount of pumping that's been done based on, it's a tap, you shut it off. Technology has advanced quite a bit in agricultural irrigation over that period of time when the moratorium was put on. You know, I just think we need to move forward on this, and I think the science is there enough, and we have enough of the checks and balances can be influenced legislatively to protect our water. I mean, we all want that to happen. From my end, I just want fairness. So, thank you, Chair.
Michelle?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, gentlemen, for your presentation today. So, I mean, we've heard, and I think it's obvious that the most important thing about our our water supply is to ensure that there's safe and enough drinking water for all islanders, forever. But one of the concerns that's come up to me a fair number of times, a lot of times, is the impacts of deep water wells around domestic wells. So as you stated, there's 308 deep water wells currently, and I believe you said 32 that are used for agricultural purposes at this point in time. Is that true? Am I doing 36? Do you have any data, or have you done any monitoring around the domestic wells that are located in the vicinity of those existing wells?
Answer that. So, talking about the agricultural authority totally have 36 high capacity well permit, but annually they about use 25 well because 1 in 3 rotation. Some lands don't use for potato some years, to about 25, 26 high capacity wells in agriculture industry. So people concerned about, like previous I have slides, so 4 wells pumping, how impact on domestic well. In most case, the high capacity well, agriculture or other industries have far distance from domestic well. So if the well have 300 meters away domestic well, no impact at all. You can say 10 centimeters water drawdown in well didn't feel any impact. The problem is we did receive a lot of complaint on domestic well go dry, efficient going down. The main reason is the old well, like our fridge applicant in our home, getting older, well efficient going lower after 10, 20 years. Like other place is more serious, and the well drillers have to do a lot of work. We drill the well, we construction well, because after a long time, deposits on the bottom of the well and see on the annual space. So need to purge the well because our capacity is high in PI. Most cases we investigate that is not impacted by high capacity well. We do have 1 or 2 cases. The high capacity well or low capacity well, just 30 meters away from the domestic well, and that causes domestic well problem. If you see domestic well have 100 meters away from high capacity well or irrigation high capacity well, usually no problem at all.
Michelle?
Could I just add to that? So one of the things also when we're looking at an application for a high capacity well, and I'll get back to the low capacity well stuff in a second, as part of the process is when they are doing a pump test, we also have an observation well if there's anything within what we used to use was half a kilometer distance, and you would monitor the water level in that. So you actually have not just a guess, but you have empirical evidence as to what the impact of pumping this high capacity well will be on surrounding low capacity wells. So that's one of the things we've looked at right from day one. And I'd have to say that I'm no longer involved in that section, but it was very rare for us actually to get a complaint about a dry well. The situation where you've got multiple low capacity wells causing a problem is kind of unique because we don't provide permits for low capacity wells. So we have no way of having that check on what their impact, if you have say 4 49.5 gallon a minute wells close together, their impact would be the same as a high capacity well, but there's no permitting process for them at this point, which is one of the reasons why we're keen to get the Water Act going and get these regulations going, so we actually will be supervising those and being able to say, no, you can do this, but not that, or whatever. So it's an important distinction to make. Simple fact is we have seen the odd occasion, and I say odd, probably on one hand, the number of occasions in 20 or 30 years where a high capacity well has caused problems. There was in Stratford, when they expanded their water system initially, a couple of domestic wells were affected there. And the answer there is, they can't get away with doing that without providing some remedy. In that case, they hook people up. I can think of a couple other cases with high-capacity wells where there was a house that was abandoned at the time, and then it was occupied, so there were impacts there, which would be, again, rectified. But it's not a common factor. And as Qin mentioned, if you're more than a couple hundred meters away, it's difficult to actually measure the amount of drawdown. Now, if you're 50 meters away, it'd be a different story. But part of the process of providing these permits in the first place is to consider exactly that, and not just on a guess, but the empirical evidence from the actual pump testing, where we would say, okay, we've pumped this, we can derive parameters for the aquifer, we can make projections by modeling, but we can also rely on the fact that we actually measured the water level in the nearest wells and said, okay, the drawdown is 10 centimeters, or there's none at all, or whatever. So it's something we take very seriously.
Michelle?
And thank you for that. And thank you, Chair. So I guess whether a well goes dry, that would be one side of it. But then if the person actually had to dig deeper for their domestic wells, do you carry statistics, or do you carry data on when that has occurred? So for instance, from what has been explained to me, is when you have a regular well at a certain depth, and then you have a high-capacity well, which is much deeper, drawing water from below. Have you tracked, or have you considered data around any domestic wells that may have had to dig deeper in order to access well, may not have gone dry, but have had to go deeper?
Again, it would be the same sort of circumstances. So when we are making those, decisions on a pump test stuff, we'd say, okay, by the way, it doesn't matter if it's taking the water from deep or shallow, because most of the water is coming in from the shallow part of the well anyhow. The same thing would still apply. It would be to confirm that the drawdown at that distance is, 20 centimeters or 1.5 meters, or what it would be. So if it was going to cause a problem for a domestic well, it would cause a problem regardless. I mean, the deepening of the well part would not be because the water level changed. Like if we're measuring an observation well, a domestic well, and the well's 75 feet, and we're predicting, well, the water level is going to go down to 72 feet, then we'd say, no, that's not acceptable. Right? So I'm not aware of situations like that. There are cases where people do have wells redrilled for various reasons. Whether they're high-capacity wells or not, certainly the process we go through should eliminate that as a possibility.
You good? Thanks. Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. So something that Robbie brought up that triggered another set of questions for me, and I will try to be quick on them. But we often talk about, and Dr. Van den Heuvel did as well, the potential benefits to water quality of irrigating, how nitrogen would be better uptaken and less likely to end up in the rivers. And I know we've had quite a number of studies done on water quality on PEI. I was just wondering if you could tell me if any of the recommendations of any of those studies on how to improve nitrogen levels in the water included increased agricultural irrigation.
I would have to go back and look at them, but the Nitrate Commission would be the one I'm most familiar with, and I don't read it that frequently, so I'm not sure. Certainly, the science behind the idea is sound, and I think actually, well, Yifeng didn't mention it a couple of weeks ago, he's actually conducted some research on this out of the research farm as well. But in terms of whether it was a recommendation of the Nitrate Commission, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head.
Lynn?
I wonder if you might be willing to provide that information back to the committee. But one other question or comment I will say that we have, the Special Committee on Climate Change actually had an opportunity recently to have a conversation with the Department of Agriculture in California. And something that they brought up that came as an enormous surprise to us is that when you apply irrigation to nitrogen fertilizers, it creates nitrous oxide, which is actually 300 times more impactful per ton than carbon when it comes to warming and greenhouse gases. And with the province recently committing to getting to zero by 2040, I wonder if you can speak to the potential conflict there.
I haven't actually looked at that part. It's an interesting one. The production of nitrous oxide is kind of a leaky part of the nitrogen cycle. I'm not qualified to really comment on how significant it would be. It's not part of the main sort of cycle of nitrogen one would see. And it might depend very much on the conditions. So we'd have to, look at it in more detail. The stuff I was more involved with is really the sort of closing the loop in terms of plant uptake versus leaching. in terms of the effect on, say, denitrification or things like that, would be a natural sort of process that's not significant on PEI. In terms of the production of nitrous oxide, that's not a part of the cycle I'm very familiar with. But again, it would be worth us, if you want to send us any information, we can certainly have a look at it. Yeah.
Thanks, Lynn. Ola, for our final question.
Thank you. I was wondering if you were to issue limited permits for water extraction for agriculture sometime in the future, how would you assign it so it would be fair? There would be some areas, presumably, where you wouldn't be able to grant the license, for instance, in the Winter River area where it's already extracting more than is responsible there. Would you look at it as a percentage of recharge on your piece of land, for instance? What do you imagine would be the issue to give some people fair access to some water in a responsible way?
It's an interesting question, Ole. In the Water Act itself, there are some priorities where you have higher priority for domestic and fire than for industrial uses. So that would play perhaps an overriding role in making that kind of question. Certainly to date, PEI's management is more on a first come, first served strategy. Whether that will translate into the future specifically that way hasn't been detailed in the draft water withdrawal regulations. And so what I can say now in terms of commitment is that we would definitely be following the criteria in the regulations and act that set those priority levels. But beyond that, it's difficult to say at this time how it would be apportioned.
Thank you. All right, and
Can I just
sure.
add to that just briefly? Again, one of these things that, not trying to kick things down the road, but Part 4 of the Water Act talks about water management planning areas. And I would see that potentially as one of the vehicles for discussion involving the appropriate level of consultation, all that, as to how exactly, if there's a watershed where water's at a premium, how it would be used. As Bruce alluded, there are specific priorities listed in the Act itself, which would have to be respected. And beyond that, that might be something where, it would be done on a case-by-case basis, looking at the nature of the watershed and the stakeholders and things like that, and how best to allocate remaining resources.
Thank you very much. Is there, I guess, any final comments before?
I just have a question for Lynn. In terms of the stuff you mentioned from California, was it specifically relating to irrigation, or was it just relating to the fate of nitrogen? Because, on good years, it rains anyhow, we still have the water, and whether it comes out of a well or out of the sky. So I'm just curious as to, was it a study specifically looking at irrigation, and did it create different conditions than you would from rainfall?
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. As I understood it, and I'll have to review the transcript, but they were talking about irrigation specifically because it's more consistent access to water than rainfall is. But I just did a quick scan on Google Scholar looking for some research papers after that meeting, and there seems to be quite a number of them. So perhaps I could forward along a couple of research papers.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you all for your time this morning. We're just going to recess for a moment and then get ready for our next presentation. All right, welcome back. I just want to introduce our next, our guests with us from the National Farmers Union. We have Douglas Campbell and Edith Ling, and I don't have your name written down in front of me, and I know I've met you before, but pardon?
Reg Phelan.
Reg Phelan,
Yeah.
thank you. And with that, we're just going to jump right into the presentation, and then we'll do questions, and I apologize for the noise, but they're renovating the building, and we're used to it. I know you're probably not, so. All right, but with that, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to address the Standing Committee on Natural Resources and Environmental Sustainability in regards to the island's invaluable natural resources of land and water. In this presentation, we are sharing our grave concerns around these two resources, as we believe committee members need to be fully aware of the interconnection between the health of farming, these two resources, and the public responsibility of ensuring they are utilized and protected for the good of all farmers and all islanders. Because of misconceptions that have arisen about our organization, we feel it is important to begin our presentation by telling the committee a little bit about the National Farmers Union, which was nationally formed in 1969. The NFU is the only Canadian farm organization incorporated by an Act of Parliament of Canada, with a mandate to promote the economic and social betterment of Canadian farmers. We are the only Canadian voluntary national farm organization committed to ensuring family farms, of which many incorporate for tax purposes, are the primary unit of food production. The NFU promotes environmentally safe farming practices, the building of healthy, vibrant rural communities, and assurance of an adequate supply of safe, nutritious food for Canadians through sustainable farming practices. Our vision desires social and economic justice for farmers, consumers, and the earth. We have no political affiliation and are nonpartisan in politics. The full list of our objectives can be viewed on the national website. The NFU partners with numerous groups and organizations with like-minded goals. We also try to work with those who may not be in total agreement with our vision, because for us, farmers are the priority. District 1 is the local chapter of the national organization. We have a strong membership and presence in this province and maritime region. We have always spoken out strongly for farm families and our natural resources, in particular the land. You may be interested to know that the NFU was instrumental in having the Lands Protection Act passed in the PEI Legislative Assembly in 1982. Our mandate often results in the National Farmers Union not being invited to the policy table, primarily because of the ever-increasing intertwining of government and corporations, which fuels the growing concentration of wealth and resources in the hands of a few. The reason we can stay true to our mandate is that our funding is membership-driven, not government or corporate influenced or financed. The National Farmers Union stands against the industrialized farming model, which is the large-scale, intensive production of both plants and animals, often under a monoculture strategy. This farming model is becoming increasingly heavily dominated by large vertically integrated corporations interested in consolidating natural resources for the greatest profit. Small and medium-sized independent family operations are being forced out of business, while large-scale independent operations are being heavily forced out of business. While large-scale independent operations are being heavily impacted by debt load and low commodity prices. The social and economic health of rural communities continues to erode. The national food sovereignty is an afterthought. Now, something that's not written in here, but it's worth noting, was that this is not only the stance of the National Farmers Union, but it was a consensus that was done by a commission of the committee of a 2008 study entitled Growing the Island Way. This study deals with moving beyond the industrial model of farming and also emphasizes the dire consequences for the environment in not doing so. And it was also powerful enough of a statement that it made it into the way of the land banking report that Kevin Arsenault did for this government. The pandemic has shined a bright light on some of the cracks in industrialized vertical integrated farming. A prominent Canadian example was the episode in Alberta where the food chain supply became unstable when Cargill, the dominant player in Canadian beef, was affected by COVID-19 entering the workforce in the largest killing plant in Canada. The long-term solution suggested by the Commodity Marketing Board was a reduction in jobs and an increase in mechanization of meat plants. The local example is the $4.7 million taxpayer gift to Cavendish Farms, quickly arranged through the Potato Marketing Board after the billionaire processor suggested a short time into the pandemic that his contract growers might want to look for other markets. Other island businesses received loans after government determined through due diligence if they had financial need due to COVID-19 and were a creditable risk. Industrialized farming is a known contributor to climate change through its heavy dependence on fossil fuels and chemical inputs, deforestation, destruction of wetlands, and intensive monoculture or single crop farming of land. Add to that globalization of the food chain, thanks in part to free trade agreements. It has been known for some time that due to increasing climate change, dry summers were going to become a fact of life on PEI, and there was a need to search out cash crop diversification opportunities while trying to decrease dependence on traditional staple crops that need consistent or significant growing season rainfall levels. It has been known the health of our land would be a contributing factor in enabling island farmers to weather the changes of climate change. The response to such knowledge has been a continuation of industrialized farming practices with a few minor modifications, along with an increasing dependence on the cash crop of potatoes, in particular for the processing market. Extensive and serious damage to the health of our organic matter of island soil has been a result and is increasing the impact of climate change. The island government is aware of the state of the land. The results of the Department of Agriculture's 20-year study on soil health was released in 2018 and shows that we are in serious trouble with our limited 8 inches, if that, of topsoil. The NFU would suggest that every member of this committee familiarize themselves with that report, and we put there where it can be viewed at. Industrialized farming proponents see access to water for irrigation as a tool to offset increasing climate change woes. It is no secret that the main player in the ask for irrigation is Cavendish processor Robert Irving. Irving, who is already accessing large amounts of island water, is very open and vocal about his water irrigation wants for his family potato operations and his grower. The power and the control by Cavendish Farms as the only potato processor in the province should not be understated. It is true some island farmers are asking for irrigation rights, but not all island farmers are asking, nor would all farmers need irrigation to the same extent, or could even use it. By not making the ownership and stewardship of our land a priority, successive island governments must shoulder a great deal of the responsibility for the current state of affairs in island agriculture. where water is now being demanded as another tool in the toolbox of unsustainable industrialized farming. Island history is steeped in the land question. It has constantly been under threat from absentee, foreign, and corporate ownership and control. The most recent tool for keeping island land in the hands and the control of bona fide islanders was the 1982 Lands Protection Act. This very important piece of legislation was, in part, a response to a request from Irving's Cavendish Farms, the successor to the bankrupt Seabrook's frozen food plant in New Annan, to buy another 6,000 acres to add to the 3,000 acres it already owned. It was known at that time, 38 years ago, that land ownership by the Cavendish Farms processor would put them in direct competition with farmers and in a heightened position of control in the potato sector. The spirit and the intent of the act was to ensure farmers farmed and processors processed. In the early days of the Lands Protection Act, Cavendish Farms, along with others, had to divest themselves of some land in order to comply with the provisions of the act. But as a result of government failure to enforce the spirit and the intent of the act, the Irving processing family has acquired large land holdings. They are now in direct competition with farmers, which gives them extensive control over farmers and government. The expansion of potato processing on the island has resulted in a large increase in the land acreage being directed for that purpose. This agricultural sector is increasing in its domination of island farming with a number of consequences, including one, an ever-increasing slide towards monoculture agriculture with limited crop rotation. That has resulted in decreased organic matter in the soil, leading to wind and water erosion, inability of the soil to hold moisture, decreased fertility requiring greater chemical inputs and pest issues. Two, increasing land prices that have resulted in the need to intensively farm the land for the greatest yield to make bank payments. High land prices being paid by the potato sector, making it difficult, if not impossible, for other farming sectors to compete and secure the land they need for viability. Where banks once would not look at land as collateral, they are now hungry for it and gearing expansion and operating capital around land holdings. This is making it very difficult for smaller farmers. Also, in the past, livestock producers could look to potato producers for hay, but few want to grow hay anymore. For government becoming more dependent on one agricultural sector and one major player for job creation, economic stimulation, and tax revenue, making them susceptible to influence and control. The current demand for additional water for irrigation as a tool to prop up unsustainable farming practices. The demand for agricultural water for irrigation as a tool to prop up unsustainable farming practices. The agreement being put forth this year by those wanting more agricultural irrigation without major change to industrialized farming practices is that even farmers with good organic matter are suffering. Yes, even good soils are stressed, but if you have driven through the countryside in late August or September, you would have seen fields of potatoes that were not wilted and remained healthy green. Some were irrigated fields, but many were simply fields with high organic matter. Edith is going to take over.
In a recent presentation to members of the NFU board concerning his upcoming water study commissioned by the PEI government, Dr. Michael Vanden Heuvel was asked if irrigation makes a difference in potato yield. His response was, in a drought year, yes, In a normal year, little difference. Again, this is reason to show why water usage must be part of a bigger overall plan. There also must be acknowledgement of problems that farmers are encountering in growing potatoes using irrigation. It is not as straightforward as some would have us believe. Based on the theory of economies of scale, Cavendish Farms, the PEI Marketing Board, and the PEI Federation of Agriculture are asking for island land limits to be increased, so even more land can be put into potatoes to feed the processing plant. As wet falls become a climate change trend, we saw how well farmers managed to dig the acres they had in the fall of 2018, when approximately 7,000 acres were left in the ground. When Horace Carver did his land study, The Gift of Jurisdiction, Our Island Province, in 2013, he tried to source studies proving agricultural profitability would increase with larger land holdings. No such study could be found. The personal experience of farmers has been that as we strive to become more efficient, our debt loads increase and margins tighten, while processing corporations reap the profitability by getting more for less. We question the truthfulness of the line that some farmers will go under this year because they couldn't irrigate. Some will go under, but for reasons far deeper than access to irrigation. Farmers have been financially squeezed to the point that margins are paper thin. A drought year with lower yields will be a tipping point for some. Island politicians over the past 3 decades have been and continue to be woefully ignorant of the Lands Protection Act, which is entrenched in the Canadian Constitution. Some appear to be even apologetic for the Act. Dennis Qing, in the lead up to the recent election, told the National Farmers Union that within 6 months of being elected, there would be a mandatory course to educate all MLAs on the Lands Protection Act. The promise was repeated in his government's first throne speech, and we're now a year and a half into his government's mandate and have yet to see that happen. Nor has the current government reversed the work of former Premier Wade McLaughlin, who introduced the Companies Act, so that company directors don't have to be listed. Had island governments honored the Lands Protection Act, many of the current issues surrounding the land would have been avoided. Successive governments have done a disservice to island farmers by the weakening of the Department of Agriculture. It has left farmers to the ways and wants of industry. A strong department with district offices that puts specialists back out into the farming community needs to be built back for the good of individual farmers, the farming community, and the future of agriculture. The department, along with enforcing soil building policies, needs to be sourcing and supporting greater diversification of viable cash crops and building back other farming sectors. Farmers would be greatly helped if the government re-established an aggressive land banking program, as was introduced by the government of Alex Campbell under the Comprehensive Development Plan, as a way to strengthen the viability of agriculture, bring young people into the field, and keep our lands in the hands of bona fide residents of PEI. It was a considerable struggle Campbell undertook, which continues into the present, chiefly because of people's concern for themselves first and concern for a balanced, functioning environment and society last. We would recommend that you committee members read the book, Between Two Cultures, The Alex Campbell Years by Wayne McKinnon. It will shed a good deal of light on what island governments have faced concerning the land issues and agriculture in the province. If you have not done so, you should also be reading the 4 land studies done since the Lands Protection Act was implemented. And now we're in the midst of yet another one. Yet, when Horace Carver appeared before this committee in the spring of 2020, he told you that it is the Legislative Assembly that has the power to make the changes in the Act. Therefore, it would be helpful if MLAs knew the Act. Why are we going to have another study to collect dust like the previous 4? The current government received the report entitled Considerations on Implementing a Farmland Bank in Prince Edward Island, done by Dr. Kevin Arsenault, December 2019. Yet it seems to be collecting dust somewhere in Stephen Meyer's office. If this committee has not yet seen the report, you should be asking for copies and bringing the discussion to the floor of the fall session of the Legislative Assembly. The National Farmers Union feels a strong current land banking program would help farmers access land at reasonable costs, thus enabling them to farm it in a more sustainable manner with longer rotation cycles and emphasis on organic matter. This, no doubt, would ease the need for water. While the Department of Transportation, Infrastructure and Energy could be involved in the land banking program through the initial purchasing of the land, the NFU believes the Department of Agriculture and Land should run the program. There is a growing lack of faith in government by both farmers and public. We have witnessed government break its own environmental regulations to accommodate the big players, as was recently witnessed with the allowing of extraction of irrigation water from the Dunk River when it was below recommended levels for the protection of fish. It speaks volumes about control and too much dependence on one sector of agriculture. It also increased public cynicism and directs distrust toward the entire farming community. Government has to be clear on environmental objectives. On one hand, we are witnessing tree lines being torn out to increase field size for the large machinery that comes with large potato acreage and to put irrigation systems in place. Yet on the other hand, we see the Department of Agriculture offering incentives to plant hedgerows to prevent wind and water erosion of the soil. In the Stephen Harper days, scientists and environmentalists were telling his government that without an environment, there is no economy. The concerns surrounding our land can't be separated from the usage of water. If exploitation of the land is allowed to continue, then exploitation of water will increase. The NFU takes the position that if the role of water is to be extended in agriculture production, then its usage must be a regulated part of a far broader strategy that addresses stewardship of the land and the greater good of farmers, the environment, and rural communities. The taps just can't be turned on to increase the profits of certain players, nor can it be self-regulated, which is pretty much the case now. There is plenty of agricultural irrigation happening on PEI. As successive governments keep kicking the issue down the road, many agriculture stakeholders have found unregulated ways to get the water flowing, perhaps unaware or unconcerned about environmental impacts. The government, which is supposed to represent all people of the province, needs to be a leader in the question of land and water, rather than a follower of private corporate industry. There is no room on this small island to allow the interests of a few to overpower the greater good. The water study hasn't even started, and already people are suspect because of who is directly and indirectly involved. The National Farmers Union is concerned that science will be used to prove that there is enough water available to maintain unsustainable farming practices, and as a further way for government to avoid uncomfortable decision-making while permitting uncontrolled usage to continue. Much has changed since the Alec Campbell days, when many islanders were passionate about the land. As we have become more urbanized and another generation removed from the farm, it has been a challenge to awaken islanders to what is happening with land ownership and stewardship. But they are becoming aware. However, water is a different matter. Everyone needs the resource. The awakening will not take as long to happen, nor will government be as easily forgiven for its missteps. For years, we have raised concerns about island land ownership as we witness more and more land fall under the control of foreign and corporate entities. We have raised concern about farming practices that are hugely impacting soil organic health and the land's future viability to produce food. It is not enough to say the earth is dry and more water will solve the issue. We have raised the issues facing independent farmers, many of whom are concerned with what a government nod to increased water usage will mean for their future. Will it bring more financial issues and greater control in their operation by the processor? Will they get that processing contract if they don't irrigate to produce that perfect processed fried potato? Farmers are under tremendous stress, but many are ever hopeful. Hope is often all that makes farming possible. Some farmers see irrigation as a way to keep farming without having to make changes. Others accept the falsehood that their level of efficiency is the problem. Others are buying into the economic theory that if they get bigger, they can make it. But is having little control over the price received for a product and the manner in which it is produced, and assuming large debt, is that making it? Things may look good from the road for many island farmers, but there is trouble in the farmyard. Many say there are three kinds of processed farmers right now. Those long established who built up equity in the good days and have the financial stability to stay in the game. Then there are those just getting by but carrying too much debt to back away. And there are also those that must have that signed contract before the bank will give them operating money. Premier King states that the potato sector is worth $1 billion to the island economy, but it comes at a great cost when a few dominate and dictate. Land ownership has been compromised. The health of our land has been compromised. Are we willing to stand by and watch the same happen to our water? Or are we going to demand a comprehensive strategy to be put in place that restores our land and ensures our environmental resources are cared for and shared? Are we going to take action to make the industry sustainable? There is a saying, everybody wants things to be different, but nobody wants to change. We are facing a massive challenge. If it is not dealt with in a multifaceted manner, the future of our farmers is greatly jeopardized, as is the economic, physical, and social welfare of the province. Many are not yet ready to acknowledge it. We need a real leadership from a knowledgeable government and the MLAs and public servants as well. To be a true leader is to make hard decisions for the greater good. Doing nothing and kicking the can down the road on the water, the land, as well as refusing to stand against the big players, is bringing us further into bondage and unsustainability. And the cost will be very great and perhaps not repairable. There are future generations to think about. Islanders need a government with backbone, one that is proactive, not reactive, one that is not scared to take the risk of making the hard leadership choices that builds an independent tomorrow. People, if you haven't realized it yet, the concern is about a lot more than access to water for irrigation. It is about the interconnectedness and protection of the resources of land and water. It is about the health of our farmers and rural communities. It is about sustainable, diverse farming if we want agriculture to continue to be the largest contributor in the island resource economy. It is about the right to clean, safe water for all. It is about a strong economy, not overly dependent on one industry or one employer. It is about building something better for everyone. And these are our recommendations to this committee. We're asking the committee to include the following recommendations in your report to the Legislative Assembly. 1, add to the Corporate Business Registry a personal name search field as promised by Premier Dennis King at the pre-election all candidates debate. 2, companies incorporating federally and registering to do business in PEI must disclose shareholders and directors. 3, that all IRAC recommendations to Executive Council concerning land transactions be made public, as promised by Premier Dennis King in the election campaign. 4, the Progressive Conservative promise be immediately kept for a mandatory course for all MLAs on the Lands Protection Act. 5, a land banking program be immediately introduced. 6, land required to be divested because of circumvention of the Lands Protection Act be some of the first land purchased for the newly established land bank. 7, the land banking program be administered by the Department of Agriculture and Land. 8, that the government begin the rebuilding of a strong Department of Agriculture and Land throughout the province. And 9, government implement comprehensive strategies to move towards a sustainable farming model in Prince Edward Island. And all of this is respectfully submitted by the National Farmers Union, District 1, Region 1.
Thank you. Do we have questions? Michelle?
Great, thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation and going through that in-depth history as well, because I think it's important that we know where the Lands Protection Act came from, why it was actually so important to the island at the time, and what I would like to direct my questions around is the changes that you've seen in how the Lands Protection Act has actually been enforced over the years. So, as you're aware, we had a recent investigation completed on a land transaction in the Badek area. To your knowledge, did you have any conversations with anybody, either from Executive Council or from IRAC or anything like that, around that report?
September the 10th, there was 3 organizations met with Premier King, and at that time he said to us that the report was done. At that time the investigation was done, and that the parties involved had 30 days to respond. And we asked him who the parties were that were involved, and he didn't comment. So the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, enough time had lapsed, 30 days and more, that I called Blois Thompson's office to ask him if he had any information on the investigation, and the secretary that I was talking to called back after a while and said she asked the question to the deputy minister, who said that they had no knowledge of any investigation being completed.
Michelle?
Okay. So about 2 months ago, and so now we know that the report is complete, and as of last week, the minister has stated that he does have the report. Based on your experience, and you've been around a long time, from your experience, did IRAC do these kinds of investigations historically and provide public rulings on their findings?
To my knowledge, and maybe Reg could be better to answer this question, but I only know of one other investigation that IRAC has done, and we had asked them to do, if we provided information, to do an investigation. To our knowledge, that's never been done, and public has no way of knowing if IRAC has ever done an investigation, because we have no way of knowing. Executive Council doesn't give what IRAC tells them. Doesn't give that out.
Michelle?
Thank you, Chair. So back in the early 90s, when IRAC was actually put in charge of well, I guess the responsibility of enforcing the Lands Protection Act and doing the investigations around it, my understanding was that they were an arm's length organization that didn't actually just make recommendations to government. They actually did it was public, and so they would do the investigation, and then they would put that through an advisory board, and then they would actually make everything public. And then it was just a few months later that things had changed and government had been put into the mix at that point in time. So kind of removing some of that arm's length ability that IRAC would have. One of your recommendations here is that IRAC recommendations to Executive Council concerning land transactions be made public as promised, as an election campaign promise. But so would you be in agreement that government should government even be involved in making these types of recommendations, or should government be out of the mix completely and allow an organization to do the investigation and to make that public without government interference?
I have been asked that question before, actually by Peter Bevan Baker one time, and my comment at that time was no, because the Lands Protection Act is the responsibility for enforcing that act is government. It's hard to stay on that mindset, because without our government actually knowing what the act consists of around the spirit and the intent, you know, maybe there are other options out there. I don't know, Reg, if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I think your comments are quite correct earlier there, where IRAC used to have a much more independent position in terms of looking at the recommendations within the Lands Protection Act and other areas. But that was since changed. You're quite correct on it. We had a meeting with IRAC there, it's probably 2-3 years ago, and they said that they had direct pressure from the government, even the Premier at the time, for them not to be involved or to release certain information that they had. They were pretty near going to tell us at that meeting about that, the study they had done. One was a particular study on the amount of land that monks have in southern Kings County, and they had an accounting firm and others do quite a bit of a detailed study on it. but they were told not to release it and the information about it at that time. So it's been ongoing for the last couple of years, that the pressure on them.
Michelle?
Thank you, Chair. So I guess I'm very pro public knowing information and having access to information, because if you don't have that transparency, it's hard to hold government to account. It's hard to hold anybody to account if information is not made public. And so based on this number 3, which is I think the one that I'm in agreement with a lot of your recommendations, but number 3, making those recommendations public, have you ever had a conversation after after this government was put in place as to why that hasn't happened yet, when it was something that was discussed as a promise?
No.
Okay.
Michelle?
If I could just elaborate on that, that question makes me think of when we met with Wade McLaughlin when he was Premier. He said, if you want changes to IRAC, go to IRAC. And Scott McKenzie at IRAC said to us, if you want changes in IRAC, go to government. So,
Michelle?
It's quite a hot potato, isn't it? Yes. If you keep passing it back and forth and nobody's held accountable and nobody's responsible. So the only person that loses then is the public. And I feel like you feel that challenge, but if nobody is willing to take responsibility of whose responsibility it is, that's certainly something that I think this committee, not being a member, a full-time member of this committee, but I certainly think that's something that this committee should absolutely dig into. Because if IRAC doesn't think it's their responsibility and government doesn't think it's their responsibility, so whose responsibility is it?
and an interesting comment to go along with that too is, I'm assuming Brad Trivers is still responsible he is the minister responsible for IRAC. When we met with Brad Trivers, he did make the comment one time that IRAC told him that even though he's minister, that he is not the boss of us. Those aren't his words exactly, but.
Yeah, I'm just
Michelle, how many more?
I'm just going to read one more.
One more.
Yeah, and then, so I'm just going to make a point. Section 15(1) of the Lands Protection Act, minister may conduct investigations. But it states here, the minister, the commission, or any person authorized by the minister may request information and conduct an investigation. So I guess my question, and I don't even think it's for you guys because you probably don't have an answer, but I would pose a question to say, why didn't the commission, when they found out that there was suspicion of contravening of the act, why didn't the commission initiate an investigation instead of the minister having to do that on their behalf? And when that's laid out in the Lands Protection Act, I would think that that gives them the obligation to actually look into it.
And that makes you question, doesn't it, past decisions that IRAC has made when it comes to the land holdings that we have by certain people on this island. How much of an investigation was really done and what was their reasoning for doing so? Were they following just the letter of the law, which seems to be something that is very convenient to use, rather than following the spirit and the intent? Because the two would, I would think, if the two were investigated, you would come up with two very different scenarios.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for being here today.
Rob?
Just going over some of your recommendations here, and there's one stands out as the land banking issue, and I'll say, I certainly was intrigued by the concept and supportive of the concept until you start to get into a little more detail around it, then it becomes a lot more complicated, and now I've kind of question on whether it's a viable thing to do and in the best interest of landowners or farmers. Do you have a certain monetary value on how much money would take to acquire the amount of land that you'd want to see a land bank? And I get maybe over a period of years.
Well, you've got me intrigued too as to why you don't think it's viable anymore. I'd like to hear your question,
Well, I asked you the question first, but I do the second question will explain a bit maybe more to that.
I don't think you can put a price on what our land is worth, Robbie, because it's our only resource that we have on this island. And if we were to lose that as an island, as a jurisdiction, I think.
To elaborate a bit further, but the problem is that currently farmers own land now, and if they're looking at getting out of agriculture at some point, and then some entity purchases that land, that farmer getting out is wanting money, or to pay their debts. I mean, most farms have a certain amount of debt that they're carrying. I mean, hopefully they have enough equity, and they come out of it with a little in their pocket. But it does take a certain land value to do that. So when you asked me the question back, have you had any conversations with Indigenous groups around land banks and how that would work?
Not directly, but through other resources and stuff, they're telling us that when it comes to Indigenous rights around land, it seems to be something that government uses as an excuse not to move forward.
Rob?
I might also add that nationally, the union does have some contact in this area, and we have a national committee that's an Indigenous committee that's working on this issue, and we are in contact with particularly one area in southern BC where there's quite a bit of involvement in Native interest in land there.
Rob?
Well, I just think it's a point that has to be, because in Prince Edward Island there have been no land claim settlements in Prince Edward Island, right? So there's a big question mark around how land is owned and transferred and things of that. And you're probably well aware that the province has what's called a duty to consult, and any transfers of land that are owned by the government, i.e. a land bank is owned, if it's owned by the government, then there has to be some consultation and usually some sense of compensation or things of that nature. So I think it sort of has created a bit of a big question mark around that, and I guess that's why I'm starting to have some concerns of the viability of a land bank, because in the end of the day, we want farmers to own the land, to own their own land. I don't think we necessarily want farmers to be tenants to the king or to the queen or to the government or those types of things. So we went through that one time with absentee landlords, so we don't want to repeat and go back into that level. So I think that's where some of the concerns. So I guess all I'm saying is an NFU or as an organization, you may need to have some consultation with the Indigenous groups in the province, and because the conversations I've had with them certainly would create pause for concern on the viability of a land bank when we do that. So
But we shouldn't use that as an excuse not to pursue it.
Rob?
Well, I would certainly argue it may not necessarily be an excuse, but it is a hard reality that there have been treaty rights and there have been arrangements made with Indigenous people that has been upheld many times in court proceedings. I mean, we're seeing it with the fishing industry and things of that nature. So it's just something that it is a reality that's out there that we cannot just simply dismiss. And you and I live not too far from an Indigenous area where a high percentage of people reside, and it's just something that has to be kind of corrected and figured out and negotiated and arrangements made, because in the end of the day, I don't think we want to have government purchasing the land twice over, to try to straighten this stuff out. So that's all. I just wanted to make that comment and to.
I think the right answer to that would be for you or this committee to talk to Dr. Kevin Arsenault that did the land banking report, because I'm pretty sure he's addressed that issue in the report.
Yeah, I haven't seen Kevin's report, so I can't comment on that. So anyway, that's all the questions I had. Thanks.
Just a comment on that, we did have legal advice on that, and it said not to be an issue. And I would be very surprised if it were an issue, given how the indigenous people respect the earth and how they would want to see it looked after properly, which would come about, I feel, with the land banking program and make it accessible to family farmers, rather than mining the land like what's going on today. So I would be very surprised if they would have an issue when the goal is to respect that precious resource that we have.
Rob?
Final comment to say, I've had conversations with the chiefs, and I don't think I'd agree. The principles of what you're saying about looking after land is right. It still boils down to ownership and control, and they have claims and issues around that only because there have been no land claim settlements in Prince Edward Island. So there's a lot of questions on a lot of territory that would have to be covered to kind of correct that issue, and I think you're seeing it nationally across the country, and governments are really challenged to try to get that right and to try to be respectful and to try to get that right, and nobody seems to have mastered it yet.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. I really appreciate everything that you've got in your report here, or proposal, presentation, sorry. The interconnection of it all is very important to me. In this case, we'd start with the land, overlay it with water, add some energy, fertilizer, and after that comes the economy that's based upon those things. So very much appreciate the recognition of how much that is intertwined. And on that note, one of the things we are wrestling with here in this committee is access to our water. And I had asked the Federation of Agriculture if they would be open to tying soil health to access to water for irrigation, and they said it was something that could be on the table. And I was just wondering what the National Farmers Union's position on that might be.
Yeah, I think that is actually in our presentation where, and that's part of the land banking as well, that Kevin has done, is that organic matter is a sign of our health, is the sign of the health of our soil. So it would only make sense that the organic matter and the health of your soil would be, interconnected with water usage.
Steve? Yeah.
That's fine, Chair.
Good.
Thank you.
All right. Good. Oh, Darlene?
Thank you, Chair. I just want to clarify something. At the very beginning, you talked about a gift to Cavendish Farms of $4.7 million, which is not truthful in any way, shape, or form. It was money made available to the potato board, and I will just clarify and be happy to know that not 1 cent of that $4.7 million was spent or given to Cavendish Farms. So this is totally not true, and I just want to make that very clear. I'm the chair of Treasury Board, so I know whether the money was spent or not. It was not spent.
Okay, well, there's been some conflicting stories around that whole issue.
As the chair of Treasury Board, I can assure you that money did not go to Cavendish Farms and was not spent. We did not need to do it. So.
Is it going to go?
It is not going to go because all of the potatoes were processed and sold. So. Chair.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is probably not the place to be asking the question, I guess, so maybe I'll just...
I'm just clarifying
Okay.
that is indeed what has happened, that the money was not needed. It never did go to Cavendish Farms, and it will not be going to Cavendish Farms.
I'd like to hear what Michelle says.
Okay, very quick. Michelle?
As Chair of Public Accounts, I'd just like to state that representatives from the Department of Finance and the Treasury Board were before the Public Accounts Committee that said that half of that money had been dispersed. So, I mean, we could look at the records on that, on Hansard, but that's on Hansard record that half of it has gone out the door.
No. What has
Darlene?
happened is there was money that was agreed to go to seed potatoes, not to go to Cavendish Farms for the storage of potatoes that needed to be processed or were processed. So that is indeed what happened. The money was not spent, but just lately there has been an application to have money for seed potatoes that, because of the pandemic, were not used. So, but it did not go to Cavendish Farms.
So I need to ask a question.
Sure.
So the 50,000, initially it was said that there was 50,000 going to Cavendish Farms to help in the cost of transporting the product to freezers or to markets. And I think Blois Thompson said that that money had been dispersed.
The 50,000? Yes.
Okay.
That was.
All right.
The 4.7 has not been.
So there has been money gone to Cavendish Farms. So money has gone to Cavendish Farms.
But not a gift of 4.7 million, no.
But we're not there yet. But 50, okay.
Okay. All right. We're going to have to wrap it up there, folks, because we're over our time here. Okay. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming in today. We appreciate your time, your presentation, and also the recommendations. That's at the back. That's very helpful because usually we don't get that from groups. So we will certainly take those into consideration when the committee comes up with its report to the legislature. All right, so we're just going to recess for a moment, and then we'll resume. All right, we're back. Okay, so number 4, review of correspondence. Leo Broderick has reached out on behalf of the PEI Coalition for the Protection of PEI Land and would like to present to the committee on land use issues and the consultation process. What's the committee's thoughts on that? Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. I would have no objection to hearing from that, but can I ask that we will not be scheduling any new witnesses until the new year? Because we will be going right up to receive
that was
on
my thought on it, is that we would do it in the
then
new
no
year.
problem.
So,
Darlene?
before Leo Broderick comes in, I did request that we did have farmers interested in coming in and presenting on, what they're experiencing, how it's affecting the family farms. I think it's very personal knowledge, and I think that was requested before we bring in Leo Broderick or anyone else. So.
Lynn?
It is my understanding that Leo Broderick is not asking to present on water usage, but on land and land issues and consultation. So I'm not sure we need to bring in farmers before we could hear from him.
Well, it's just that I
Darlene?
requested that, and it was decided that because of time, we didn't really have the time to do that. But if we're going to bring in someone else about land, I would also like to bring in, just say, we don't have time to listen to farmers, to hear their personal experiences and how they are concerned about what's going on. We don't have time for Leo Broderick either.
So perhaps maybe we can have Leo in the new year, who represents the PEI Coalition for the Protection of PEI Land, so he represents this group. And then perhaps in the new year, if there is farmers or whatnot that would be interested in coming in, we could have them in. Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. I believe if we were to review Hansard, the last time we had talked about this, we had said the problem with inviting farmers, it's not that we're not interested in hearing from farmers, we agreed we're very interested, but how do you determine which farmers? We would all be wanting to bring in farmers from our own districts. We had said it would be useful to hear from the National Farmers Union, the Federation of Agriculture, which we have done. I'm just not sure how we would ever decide which farmers we bring in as individuals.
Okay, so we'll leave it at, I think the committee's in agreement that we'll send the invitation to Leo, and that'll be in the new year. Our next correspondence is from Scott McKenzie. I believe you all have that in front of you. I guess discussion from the committee on it. Michelle? I thought you might have your hand up.
So I don't have the correspondence in front of me,
Oh, so-
but I do believe that having IRAC.
I guess I could read it out for you.
Sure.
It just says, Ms. Campbell, further to your email, respectfully, it is the commission's opinion that it is not appropriate for the commission to speak to the committee about the report. The report is now in the hands of the minister, and only the minister can speak to it. Signed, Scott McKenzie. So, Michelle?
Okay. So my response to that would be, IRAC has a very clear rules of procedure to follow when they are doing a land investigation. And I think that it is important, first of all, to understand why IRAC wouldn't have triggered the investigation on their own to start with. And I also would like to hear if, from the IRAC, how they do follow the Lands Protection Act investigation rule, and if that was applied.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. So I hear the point that you're making, and I think it's a valid one. I wonder if the recommendation isn't that we ask the minister to come in to speak to the report specifically and ask IRAC to come in and speak to process. Does that make sense?
I'd be fine with that.
Michelle?
Yeah.
Can I make that recommendation or put it forward
motion?
as a motion?
Sure. What's your, do you want
The
to?
motion would be that we invite the minister in to speak to the report specifically and IRAC to speak to us on the process of these investigations, but in the new year.
That good? All right.
Committee?
Consensus?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Carried. Okay. Discussion of scheduling. I would like to, we should do a report, I think, to the legislature. This committee hasn't done one yet. So would it be okay with the committee if we did that in between the afternoon and evening session sometime during the legislature on a Tuesday or Thursday? Is that fine? No? Okay. And I think you'll kind of have a draft report. Can we circulate that beforehand and then we can come prepared? All right.
I would suggest
Hal?
do it quickly, because I think a lot of the committees are going to try to get those Tuesday and Thursday nights.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
We do have a hold, I believe, for either the 24th or 26th. That's the earliest that we can get them in. But yes, committees are kind of juggling those time slots right now.
Yeah, let's do the 24th,
Okay.
perhaps. Okay, perfect. New business? Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. Just as a quick follow-up from our presentation earlier today, I was wondering if we could follow up with George Summers and Bruce Raymond and just ask if they could clarify if any previous water quality reports have the recommendation that we use irrigation as a mechanism to deal with our water quality issues on PEI.
Sounds good. Okay. Any more new business? No? Motion to adjourn? Lynn? Thank you.